This is Faye Hammill, University of Glasgow. My talk focuses on the ways that magazine editors and advertisers collaborate to promote travel as a mode of good citizenship. In Canada, the mainstream monthly magazines of the interwar years used representations of mobility to advance consumer-based nationalism and also to raise Canada's profile on the world stage. I will be looking at the specific moment of the mid-1930s, a period during which the Depression led to somewhat of a reduction in international travel, but an expansion in domestic travel among Canadians. By 1937, though, a new financial optimism was discernible. In terms of my keywords, in the magazines of this period, discourses of worldliness emphasised participation in a broad cosmopolitan culture, and travel was a crucial element of the middle-brow culture of self-improvement. At the same time, the magazines exhibited strong nationalist commitments, which in political terms, of course, differed across the two language communities in Canada, while in consumer terms, all the magazines consistently promoted Canadian companies and products. I'm going to discuss three magazines. The Canadian Home Journal and La Revue Populaire had a more domestic, thrifty orientation, and I'll explore what kinds of trips they were proposing to their middle-class readership. Mayfair provides a contrast in that it was aimed at a wealthier class fraction, and because its coverage of travel was so extensive, I will discuss this title in the most detail. The talk emerges from two projects. One completed project on 6 mainstream magazines in Canada with Michelle Smith and Christina Judge, and the other one an ongoing piece of research on the representation of ocean liners in modern literature and print culture. These images show the other magazines which flourished alongside the three I'm covering in this talk. The domestic audience in Canada was small, and this was as many titles as it could support in the early to mid-20th century. And indeed, many of the magazines came to grief at the end of the 1950s, with just 3 surviving. The economic base of publishing companies such as Maclean Hunter depended on convincing readers to buy not only Canadian magazines rather than their American competitors, but also the products of the Canadian companies who formed a large proportion of the magazine's advertising clientele. And in our research, Michelle, Christina and I found little direct overlap in content or contributors across the Francophone and Anglophone magazines, but very extensive overlap in terms of broad themes, and especially in terms of commercial material. So a lot of the same adverts appeared in French and in English, though often with minor differences in emphasis. This slide presents some brief and simplified points with just the basic information we need in order for the rest of the talk to make sense. Nationalist thinking in English-speaking Canada was complex, but the dominant versions of nationalism drew on a sense of Canada's membership of a larger British world and encouraged commitment to empire. French-speaking populations, of course, had different potential affiliations. Attachment to France remained a major influence, and defining the distinctive identity of Francophone Canada was a key preoccupation for writers and journalists. It's important to remember that while the province of Quebec was the heartland of Francophone Canada, there were significant French-speaking communities in the other provinces. So for both language groups, the publishing industry was concentrated in central Canada, Toronto, Montreal, while the magazines constructed their audience in national terms. Turning to my first magazine then, for each of the three, I'm going to have an introductory slide like this, and then present some content from within the magazines. So the Canadian Home Journal actually was and is an underestimated influence on the development of Canadian literature, published many important authors, but its primary emphasis was on home, family and fashion. The travel features it published were related mainly to family summer holidays, and during the period we're looking at, there was a certain amount of coverage of foreign travel, mostly to Europe, but more attention to Canadian holiday possibilities. And I'm going to be looking at the issue dated June 1935. The first piece I'm looking at presents an image of each Canadian province and an invitation to Canadians to tour and get to know their own country. There's nothing here to indicate explicitly that this is, as it were, an advertorial rather than a straight travel feature, but the actual text makes this fairly clear. The unnamed author is sure all readers are longing for a trip and writes, "There's an urge to sporty fishing, to golfing, to flying over hitherto distant corners, to motoring over smooth ribbons of concrete provided by either a beneficent dominion or provincial government, to travelling in luxurious trains and boats, to cities and summer resorts of 1,000 charms." And then the second paragraph is very much in the idiom of a sales pitch rather than of reportage. So evidently there has been some collaboration with the provincial tourist boards, and the piece foregrounds government investment in making mobility easier for Canadians. These sample pages from the same issue show you the two companies which place the vast majority of the travel advertising in all the magazines I've studied: Canadian National Railways and Canadian Pacific, which owned railways, hotels and ocean liners. And you can see an advert for the Quebec Tourist Board in the middle panel. And alongside these are examples of the more dominant form of advertising in the Canadian Home Journal, that for household and feminine products, often with such marvellous straplines as the one on the right, which reads, "It's never too late for a wife to learn." How true. And domestic travel adverts in this magazine often place a strong emphasis on the educational potential of trips to other provinces and the likely dividends in terms of children's learning or adult cultural capital. The journal also tapped into the fascination with English culture, and this article is by Claire Wallace, one of its correspondents, who later became Mayfair's travel editor. She starts with an exaggerated imitation of English speech. "By Jove, where shall we eat?" And then describes her adventures in London using narration in the second person. "You get the habit of good food on the way over. I mean, you don't spend 7 days crossing the sea on the Duchess of Bedford, living on the luscious fare of an ocean liner, without feeling you want to keep it up." So this is a way of encouraging the reader to imagine herself in Wallace's place. The ship she names belonged to Canadian Pacific, so her account of the food on board becomes a form of promotion. And the rest of the part I've quoted on the slide proposes a rather pricey-sounding culinary tour, offering glimpses of various celebrities. And given the demographic of the journal's audience, we could assume that this piece is more at the aspirational end of their range of travel writing, rather than the end offering practical advice. Nevertheless, middle-class Canadians were increasingly travelling abroad. The journal occasionally ran adverts such as this one for the Empress of Britain. As well as offering an experience of luxury, the Empress also literally offers a chance to witness the spectacle of imperial maritime power by seeing the king inspecting his naval vessels. And it's important to note that this ad is for straight transatlantic crossings, which of course could be purchased at various rates because the liners usually offered first, second and tourist class tickets, and the cheaper ones would have been within the reach of many of the journal's readers. Whereas it's unlikely that the winter world cruises, to which the advert tantalisingly refers to at the end of my text here, would have been a possibility for them. You need to know something about the ship, which was the one most frequently advertised in Canadian magazines at this period. It was the first liner designed to be converted to a cruise ship for winter. That meant that it would be changed from a 3-class to an all-first-class ship, and tickets would be correspondingly expensive, not only because of the length of the journey, but also because of the standard of accommodation. Trips on the Empress of Britain were advertised in Francophone magazines too, and at this point I'll turn to La Revue Populaire. This was the most family-oriented of the magazines I've been studying, with specific features and adverts addressed to male and even child readers, but it did publish a great deal of romance fiction as well. It was particularly interested in geography and had a lot of features on travel as well as on foreign locations more generally. And I'm going to be looking at material from several issues from the mid-1930s. Here is a sample of travel advertising in the magazine. The left-hand advert is for another of Canadian Pacific's Duchess-class ships, but if you see, it's actually offering a tour from Montreal to New York rather than across the Atlantic, so it remains within the Americas. The middle advert is even more domestic for Canadian National Railway's trips to the Rocky Mountains. But the third one is a French version of the advert for the Empress of Britain that we saw before. This is the text of the advert. It is almost identical to the English language version, but it doesn't mention Singapore, which at the time was administered by Britain and a key trading post for the British East India Company, or Panama, and those places in the English language advert were used at the beginning as a way of hailing the success of the Empress of Britain around the world. And here is another one of those adverts disguised as a travel feature. It's a lot of photographs of the interior of the Empress of Britain, and it's specifically promoting the tourist class tickets. And the one difference here from similar features in the Anglophone magazines is that this one mentions the presence of a chapel. A different kind of feature. All the magazines were alive to the spectacle of travel, arrivals and departures and so on, but La Revue Populaire was the only one that occasionally presented scenes of disaster. This piece describes 3 major rail accidents, but even here we find both a nationalist and a promotional note. The writer hastens to assure readers, "Nous ne verrons pas dans notre pays de telles catastrophes." We won't see such catastrophes in our country because the railways demand such a high standard of attention and watchfulness from their employees. This very different piece is by one of the magazine's key members of staff, who wrote a women's column signed Francine between the 1920s and 1940s. This essay here offers very practical advice about how to go on a trip, and it assumes that readers will have travelled very little before. And again, we see an advert for the Empress of Britain appearing opposite. The article is from the issue whose cover I showed on the title slide, so I thought we'd have that again. The piece starts by saying that summer is the season for travel, and especially so this year, 1937, because of the coronation in London and the international exhibition in Paris, as well as because people's finances are improving. There's also a list at the end of my quoted text of possible destinations for a trip: Europe, the Caribbean, or a hotel in the US or Canada. So the expected holiday venues were exactly the same for Francophone as for Anglophone Canadians, and all the magazines seem to assume that these were pretty much the only choices. These destinations reinforce white Canadians' sense of connection with their ancestry and with the legacies of European colonialism. Francine's advice is that you start with reading about the place you're going so that you'll get the most out of it in terms of self-improvement. She offers detailed advice on packing and how to dress, for instance, for dinner on a liner. So all this shows you La Revue Populaire's address to an audience of newly mobile readers. I will move to my last magazine, Mayfair, which was modelled on Tatler in London and Vanity Fair in New York. It was beautifully produced and expensive. To us, its title indicates a colonial cringe, though the way the editor, J. Herbert Hodgins, presents it in the quotation in the box, the title is meant to evoke, quote, a certain London exclusiveness, unquote, and to suggest Canada's fluency in, quote, an empire's parlance, unquote. I am starting with a set of images to show the particularly close affiliation between this magazine and Canadian Pacific, which was one of its biggest advertisers. And you can see that this cover image clearly evokes Canadian Pacific's house flag. And in turn, Canadian Pacific had close connections with government. We associate the name of this company with the building of Canada as a settler nation via the Canadian Pacific Railway and the emigrant trade. But the ships were in fact owned by a British subsidiary company, and they flew under British flags and contributed to British naval power in World War I. So the magazine and the company both functioned to cement links between Canada and Britain. This is a typical spread showing the recurrent travel adverts. And this time Canadian Pacific are directly advertising the world cruises that I mentioned before, because Mayfair's readership very much coincided with the target consumer base for these. There were also adverts for trips to Bermuda in almost every issue of Mayfair. Bermuda again is a destination that belongs firmly to the British world, and Canada's upper crust assembled in resorts there every winter. Mayfair features a particularly restricted range of destinations, and so it reports on travel not by describing places, but by photographing Canadians in them, as you see here. These were not places to see, but places to be seen in. The site other than Bermuda which gets the most attention is Murray Bay in Quebec. Once again, this is promoted in terms which heavily emphasise colonial heritage, and tourism in this area actually dates back to the 18th century. You can see here that the resort's, quote, continental air and, quote, old world atmosphere are described, and these are validated by the arrival of actual visitors from Europe. But at the same time, the writer is keen to emphasise the modernness of the place, especially in terms of its transport technologies. And again, there's a direct plug this time for an airplane company. This is an example of a feature modelled on Tatler's social reporting, in which wealthy Canadians are depicted getting on and off ships. The feature is apparently designed to emphasise Canadian cosmopolitanism, but it might seem to us to do the opposite, since the travellers mainly see the world from the decks of an ocean liner and never depart from Canadian Pacific's approved routes. You'll notice, though, a variation from the endless reporting on the Empress of Britain, since Cunard launched its new superliner, the Queen Mary, in 1936, and attention on both sides of the Atlantic turned to that ship. Mayfair's editor, J. Herbert Hodgins, was among the eager North Americans who booked passage on the maiden voyage of the Queen Mary, and he reported on it with serious hyperbole. "Not since Christopher Columbus have men and women set out with such high hopes," he says. The text emphasises the Britishness of the ship and makes an effort to prioritise it above its French rival, the Normandy. And then Hodgins suggests that even his prose is incapable of capturing the experience of travelling on this ship. He can't find the right adjective. Nevertheless, his long essay clearly promises readers a vicarious sense of participation in what he calls, quote, this unique shipboard life, unquote. The really key thing for Mayfair, though, is that Canadians had a role in the maiden voyage. The magazine's photographer recorded their presence on board and particularly picks out the Baxters, who had already achieved a prominent position in British society and were exemplars of Canada's successful exports. Hodgins also mentions at the end of this extract that a radio broadcast gave, quote, the Canadians aboard something of a thrill to hear a Canadian orchestra sending its music so clearly over the seas into the Queen Mary's fine ballroom spaces. It is interesting, though, that the advertising surrounding Hodgins' essay is all for domestic travel. This reinforces what I was saying about the vicarious travel experience which the essay represents. Even though Mayfair's readers did include Canada's wealthiest, they also included many more people who only aspired to belong to this social elite, and whose travel budget or available leisure time would actually have limited them to the destinations advertised here, such as Algonquin Park or the maritime provinces. This takes me, finally, to the use of the rhetoric of mobility to promote products that are not connected with travel. In this 1934 advert, which appeared in most of Canada's mainstream monthlies, Canada Dry Ginger Ale was described as, quote, an honoured guest at all the better hotels, clubs and restaurants, on dining cars, on ocean liners, unquote. And consumers were assured, quote, you can enjoy it in virtually every port and city of the world, unquote. So the ginger ale both represents Canada abroad and also welcomes travelling Canadians like a familiar friend. To conclude, this talk has examined how travel itself was mobilised through print in Canadian nationalist projects. The role of companies such as Canadian Pacific and Canadian National in national imaginaries allowed them to promote travel as a mode of investment that would profit both country and individual. And the close relationship of these companies with consumer magazines meant that this rhetoric permeated editorial as well as commercial content. Geographical mobility and upward mobility were consistently linked in the aspirational consumer monthlies of the earlier 20th century. Images of movement and discovery were everywhere, and Canadian magazines articulated their core values through a notion of worldliness.